The rancher ordered a bride, but a famous prostitute stepped off the wagon. That should have been the end of it, should have been simple, but nothing about Violet McCall was ever simple, and Tobias Crow was about to learn that some mistakes change. Everything. The dust hadn't even settled around the wagon wheels when he knew something was wrong. The woman standing before his ranch house wasn't the plain, God-fearing mail-order bride he had corresponded with for 3 months. This woman wore a crimson dress that clung to her curves, lips painted in a smile that promised secrets he'd never dared to dream, and carried herself with a confidence that could make a man forget his own name. Tobias stood frozen on his porch, hat in hand, watching her survey his property as if it already belonged to her. Her raven-black hair was pinned in an elaborate style far too fine for frontier life, and when her green eyes met his, something shifted in his chest that had nothing to do with disappointment, and everything to do with danger. The driver, a weathered man with nervous hands, climbed down from his seat with obvious reluctance. "Mr. Crow," he asked, his tone heavy with bad news. "I got your package here." Package? As though the most beautiful woman Tobias had ever seen was no more than a sack of grain or a saddle. He stepped off the porch, boots echoing against the boards, and tried to make sense of what stood before him. The letters had described a widow named Sarah Beth Collins from Missouri. Practical, modest, a woman searching for stability and honest work. The woman at his fence post looked like she had never done an honest day's labor in her life, and stability seemed as foreign to her as snow in July. "There's been some kind of mistake," Tobias said, his voice rougher than he meant. "I ordered a wife, not—" He gestured helplessly toward the vision in red. Violet McCall laughed, the sound like saloon music at midnight. Beautiful, dangerous, impossible to ignore. "No mistake, darling," she said, her southern drawl coating every word like honey. "Though I suppose the situation is a touch more complicated than you were led to believe." From her beaded purse, she produced a folded letter, paper yellowed, and soft from handling. "Sarah Beth Collins sent me in her place. Said to tell you she found religion and couldn't bear to leave her missionary work." Violet's smile sharpened. "She also said what you really need isn't a wife, but someone who understands the world as it truly is." Tobias took the letter with unsteady hands. Sarah Beth's handwriting was familiar, but the words made no sense. She wrote of a woman who could serve him better than any pious wife, a woman who had lived enough life to value what he offered. She wrote about Violet McCall as though sending him a gift rather than a scandal. But tucked between the lines was something that made his blood run cold. Sarah Beth warned of men hunting Violet, dangerous men who would not stop until they found her. She wrote of debts that couldn't be paid with money and mistakes that followed a person across state lines. "What kind of trouble are you running from?" Tobias asked, folding the letter, eyes fixed on her face. For just a moment, the confident mask slipped, and he saw something raw and desperate in her eyes. "The kind that gets people killed," she said quietly. "But don't worry, cowboy. I don't plan on staying long enough for it to catch up with me." That was when he noticed. The driver already back on his wagon, reins in hand, eager to be gone without even unloading her trunk. Tobias realized this wasn't a mistake at all, but something deliberate and far more dangerous. Someone had sent Violet McCall to him, knowing exactly what kind of woman she was, and knowing exactly what kind of trouble would follow. The wagon rolled away in a cloud of dust, leaving Tobias alone with a woman who belonged on his land about as much as an orchid belonged in a cattle pen. Violet stood perfectly still, watching him with those calculating green eyes, waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. "You can't stay here," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew how hollow they sounded. The nearest town was a 2-day ride, and the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. "This is a respectable ranch. I have a reputation to consider." Respectable. She tasted the word like something bitter. That's a luxury for people who've never had to choose between their reputation and their life. She walked toward him with deliberate steps, closing the distance like a hunter measuring its prey. "But I understand your concern, Mr. Crow. A woman like me could ruin a man like you just by breathing the same air." The way she said his name tightened something in his chest. He had spent 3 years alone on this ranch, 3 years since his wife died in childbirth along with their son. 3 years of talking to horses and cattle because human voices had become a memory too painful to hold. Now this dangerous beauty was looking at him like she could see straight through to the loneliness he had hidden even from himself. "It's not just about reputation," he said, steadying his voice. "You said yourself, there are men looking for you. Dangerous men. I won't have that kind of trouble brought to my land." Violet tilted her head, genuinely curious now. "You afraid of a little danger, cowboy? Or are you afraid of me?" Before he could answer, she was close enough for her perfume to reach him. Exotic, expensive, a scent with no business lingering in his rough, simple world. She reached out and touched the letter still in his hand, her fingers brushing against his knuckles. "Sarah Beth wrote more than what you read," she said softly. "She told me about your wife, about the baby, about how you've been dying a little more each day in this empty house." Her voice carried a gentleness at odds with the rest of her. The words struck like a physical blow. Sarah Beth had never once mentioned Martha and the baby in her letters. He had never told her. How could she know? Tobias whispered, his throat tight. How did she know about my wife? Violet's smile was sad now, the sharp edges dulled by something close to sympathy. "Sarah Beth Collins and I have more history than you think. We both learned the same hard lesson. What happens to women who trust the wrong men?" That was when Tobias noticed the faint scar along her jaw, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. That was when he saw the way she carried herself, always ready to run, always ready to fight. Whatever she was running from had already marked her in ways that would never wash off. "The men looking for me," she continued, her voice dropping to something almost vulnerable. "They're not just dangerous. They're connected to people with long reach and longer memories, people who don't forgive debts or forget faces." A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What kind of people?" Violet glanced toward the horizon, where the sun bled red across the sky. "The kind who own judges and sheriffs, the kind who make people disappear." When she turned back, he saw real fear behind the confidence. "But they don't know about this place yet." That word hung between them like both a threat and a promise. By the time the first stars appeared, Tobias had made his decision. "One night," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of a line already crossed. "So you can stay in the guest room tonight, but come morning you'll need to find somewhere else to go." Violet's smile softened, as though she hadn't expected even that much. "One night, then." She moved toward her trunk, still sitting, where the driver had abandoned it, and began unfastening the leather straps. "Though I should warn you, Mr. Crow, I'm not exactly the kind of house guest you're used to entertaining." He watched her struggle with the heavy trunk and found himself stepping forward before he even realized it. When his hands covered hers on the brass handle, she looked up at him with something that might have been surprise. "I may not approve of your profession," he said quietly, "but I was raised to treat ladies with respect." "Lady?" She laughed, though without bitterness this time. "It's been a long while since anyone's called me that." She let him lift the trunk, and he was struck by how light it felt for someone who looked as though she owned the world. "Most of my belongings had to be left behind," she explained. "Traveling light makes it easier to disappear." Inside the house, Tobias lit the oil lamps and guided her to the spare room Martha had once hoped would be a nursery. The irony wasn't lost on him, bringing a woman of questionable virtue into the very room where he had dreamed of raising children. "It's not much," he said, setting her trunk at the foot of the narrow bed, "but it's clean and private." Violet ran her fingers along the patchwork quilt, her touch so gentle it was as though she feared it might vanish. "It's perfect," she murmured, and he heard something he hadn't expected. Gratitude. Real gratitude, not the practiced charm she'd worn like armor since stepping off the wagon. "There's fresh water in the basin, clean towels in the chest. I'll have coffee ready at dawn." He turned toward the door, then stopped. "Violet, those men you mentioned, how long before they figure out where you've gone?" She was silent so long he thought she might refuse to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. They had someone watching Sarah Beth, someone tracking every letter, every contact she made. Her eyes held too much knowledge, too much certainty. They know about this place, Tobias. They've always known. The blood in his veins turned to ice. What are you saying? I'm saying Sarah Beth didn't send me here to save me. She sent me here to save you. Violet's hands trembled now, the confident facade abandoned. The men looking for, they don't just want me back. They want to make an example of anyone who's helped me, anyone who's shown me kindness. How long? His voice was flat, deadly calm. They were 3 days behind me when I left Kansas City. Maybe less now. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold the pieces together. I thought I could stay one night, get some rest and be gone, before sunrise. But if they've been tracking Sarah Beth's letters, they already know I exist. They already know everything. Her voice cracked. Your name, your ranch, probably even what you ate for breakfast 3 weeks ago. These aren't just criminals, Tobias. They're tied to territorial politicians, federal marshals, men with resources you can't imagine. Outside, something shifted in the darkness beyond the fence line. It could have been a coyote, or the wind stirring the brush. But Tobias had lived too many nights alone on this land to mistake natural sounds for something else entirely. They're already here, aren't they? He whispered. He moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. The moonlight painted his property in silver and shadow. The pasture looked empty, the barn nothing but a dark outline. But something felt wrong, like the very air was holding its breath. False alarm, he said, though his hand stayed on the rifle by the door. Probably just my imagination. Violet stepped beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Your imagination didn't survive 3 years alone on a frontier ranch by being careless, she said softly. If something feels wrong, it probably is. She was right. The silence outside was too perfect, too complete. Even the horses were quiet, and livestock had always been better watchdogs than any hound. Tell me about Sarah Beth, he said, needing to understand how he'd been drawn into this web without ever knowing it. How did she know about Martha and the baby? I never mentioned them in my letters. Violet leaned against the window frame, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. Sarah Beth Collins isn't who you think she is, she said after a long pause. Her real name is Sarah Beth Morrison. She was married to a territorial judge in Missouri, a man with connections to dangerous people. The name hit Tobias like a blow. Judge Morrison had been mentioned in newspapers across 3 territories, always tied to rulings that favored wealthy landowners and railroad barons over common settlers. She was his wife, Violet continued, until she learned what he was truly involved in. Human trafficking, land fraud, political corruption that stretched all the way to Washington. When she tried to leave him, he had her declared mentally incompetent and locked away. Tobias's jaw tightened. How did she escape? Violet's eyes darkened. She didn't. Violet's voice carried a pride that surprised him. Judge Morrison owned the brothel where I worked. He used it to compromise politicians and businessmen, collecting secrets he could use for leverage. Sarah Beth and I became friends during his visits, and when I learned what he'd done to her, I couldn't stand by and watch. Pieces of the, puzzle finally began to align, but the picture they formed was more terrifying than anything Tobias had imagined. So the men hunting you, they work for Judge Morrison, and now they're hunting Sarah Beth too, along with anyone who's helped either of you. She turned to face him fully, and he saw genuine remorse in her eyes. I didn't know she'd been corresponding with you. I didn't know she'd send me to someone innocent, but you came anyway. I was desperate. When someone throws you a lifeline, you don't ask too many questions about where it leads. She touched his arm, her fingers warm against his skin. But now I've dragged you into something that could get you killed, and I can't live with that. Outside, one of his horses whinnied, the sound sharp with anxiety. Tobias froze. He knew his animals, every call and every mood. That wasn't the cry of a horse spooked by weather. That was recognition, the sound of sensing strangers. How many men are we talking about? Tobias asked, already moving toward his gun cabinet. Morrison keeps at least 6, Violet said. Ex-military, ex-lawmen, the kind who ask questions after they pull the trigger. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. They're professional killers, Tobias. This isn't some frontier feud you can settle in a fair fight. He pulled down his shotgun, loading shells with practiced efficiency. Maybe not, but this is my land and I know every inch of it better than they do. You don't understand, she pressed urgently. They don't just kill people, they erase them. Your reputation, your livelihood, everyone you've ever cared about. Morrison has judges and sheriffs in his pocket across 5 territories. That was when the sound came. Soft, deliberate footsteps moving across his porch, careful as a predator. Tobias signaled Violet to stay low as he crept toward the front door. The footsteps stopped, which felt more menacing than if they'd continued. Whoever was out there knew how to hunt human prey. 3 years ago, Violet whispered, her voice barely audible, you filed a claim against the Territorial Railroad Commission. Do you remember? His hand froze on the door handle. Of course, the memory cut sharp. The railroad had tried to cut tracks through his property without compensation, claiming eminent domain. He'd fought them in court and won. But the victory had drained his savings and earned him enemies in high places. Judge Morrison was the one who ruled against you at first, Violet continued. Before the appeal went to federal court, your case cost him a bribe from the railroad barons, a lot of money. Everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. This isn't about you at all, he said slowly. Not entirely. This is about me, about settling an old score, eliminating the man who dared to stand up to territorial corruption. Violet's voice was heavy with guilt. Sarah Beth sent me because she knew they were already planning to come for you. She thought if I was here, if it looked like you were harboring a fugitive, they'd reveal themselves. She wanted you to have a fighting chance. Glass shattered at the back of the house. Heavy boots hit the kitchen floor. These weren't men who planned to take prisoners. They'd come to finish what the courts couldn't. Tobias grabbed Violet's hand and pulled her toward the fireplace. The root cellar, he whispered. It connects to an old mine shaft. We can reach the barn from there. Tobias Crow, a voice called from outside, calm and professional. This is Deputy Marshal Crawford. We have a federal warrant for the arrest of Violet McCall and any person harboring a fugitive. Federal Marshal. Tobias felt his stomach turn to stone. Morrison's reach was even longer than Violet feared. A territorial judge with federal lawmen in his pocket was more dangerous than any outlaw gang. We know you're inside, Crawford continued. Surrender now and we'll make this easy. Violet clutched his hand, trembling. Her voice was a whisper of dread. They're not here to arrest anyone. Crawford works for Morrison directly. I've seen him before. Heavy footsteps moved through the kitchen, methodical and searching. More glass shattered, this time from the bedroom window. They were combing the house room by room, which meant Tobias and Violet had only minutes before discovery. Tobias lifted the trapdoor as quietly as possible, revealing the narrow wooden ladder that plunged into darkness. The root cellar had been dug by the farm's previous owner, a paranoid man who feared Indian raids that never came. Now it might be the only thing standing between them and death. Ladies first, he whispered. But Violet shook her head, her green eyes fierce in the lamplight. If something happens to you, I'm dead anyway. You go first. Besides, cowboy, I've been running from killers longer than you have. Before he could argue, she leaned forward and kissed him, soft, quick, desperate. Her lips tasted of fear, determination, and something dangerously close to hope. That's in case we don't make it. She breathed against his mouth. Then the front door exploded inward and their time was gone. Tobias dropped through the trap first, landing hard in the narrow space below. The root cellar smelled of earth and potatoes long since rotted, but the air was breathable, and the tunnel stretched toward the barn just as he remembered. Above him, Violet climbed down, pulling the trap closed, just as boots thundered across the living room floor. Where's that tunnel? She whispered, her voice tight with controlled panic. He grabbed her hand and led her forward, his free hand brushing the rough-hewn walls. The passage was narrow, forcing them into single file. They moved quickly, footsteps muffled by the damp earth. Behind them, voices echoed faintly through the floorboards. Check every room. Tear the place apart if you have to. Crawford. Wants them alive, another replied. Morrison's orders. Violet stumbled but caught herself against the wall. Her whisper was sharp in the darkness. Why alive? Morrison's never cared about keeping witnesses breathing. It was a question Tobias didn't want to consider. Men like Morrison didn't keep people alive for mercy. They kept them alive because they needed something, and that was always worse than a bullet. The tunnel sloped upward. He could smell hay and horse leather. Familiar scents that should have been comforting now felt like bait. If Crawford's men were as professional as Violet claimed, the barn would already be under watch. "There's something else," Violet said, her breath ragged from the climb and fear. "Something I didn't tell you about Sarah Beth's letter." Even now, with killers tearing his home apart, she was still holding back. "What?" "She wrote about a safe. Said you inherited it from your wife's family, with documents that might be valuable to the wrong people." Tobias froze mid-step, forcing her to bump into his back. Martha's family safe. He had nearly forgotten it existed. A heavy iron box tucked away with other keepsakes in the barn loft. Martha's father, Tobias breathed. He was a surveyor for the territorial government. He mapped railroad routes and mineral deposits across 3 states. "Survey maps," Violet said, her voice edged with realization. "That's what Morrison wants. Not just revenge over your railroad case. That safe might hold evidence that could topple his entire operation." Tobias's chest tightened. Maps worth millions, or enough to destroy every crooked contract Morrison had bought with bribes. Above them, the barn door creaked open. Footsteps moved across the wooden floor with deliberate precision. Hay rustled in the stalls as someone began searching. They were trapped, men searching the house behind them, and another combing through the barn above their only exit. "We need those maps," Violet whispered urgently. "They're the only thing keeping us alive. As long as Morrison doesn't know where they are, he can't afford to kill us." "The loft," Tobias replied grimly. 20 feet above whoever's in my barn right now." Through the thin wooden floorboards, they heard steady boots moving stall to stall. The search was precise, professional, and drawing closer to the tunnel's mouth with every step. Tobias realized the fatal flaw in their plan. The tunnel exit sat directly beneath the barn loft, right where Martha's safe was hidden. To reach their only leverage, they'd have to surface in the same place the searcher prowled. The footsteps stopped overhead. Through slats in the boards, Tobias caught the outline of a man with a rifle, sweeping each corner with cold efficiency. They had maybe 30 seconds before he found the trap door. Violet pressed something cold into his palm. A small derringer, the kind of pistol a woman in her profession might keep tucked in her corset. "2 shots," she whispered against his ear. "Make them count. I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm offering." Her green eyes burned fierce in the slivers of light from above. "Besides, cowboy, I've got more practice in desperate situations than you do." The man above them moved toward the loft ladder, the very one leading to the safe. If he climbed, he'd have high ground and a clean shot at anyone crawling from the tunnel. If they struck now, surprise was their only edge. Tobias made his choice. He shoved open the tunnel exit as silently as possible and rolled out behind a stack of hay bales, derringer in hand. The searcher stood 20 feet away, his back turned as he studied the ladder. "Drop the rifle," Tobias said, voice low. The man spun with professional speed, but Violet was already behind him, emerging from the tunnel like a shadow. She snatched a pitchfork from the wall and pressed its sharp tines against the back of his neck before he could raise his weapon. "Deputy Marshal Crawford, I presume," she said sweetly. "Though we both know that badge is about as real as your concern for federal law." Crawford was tall, scarred, the kind of man violence had shaped. He didn't flinch, and that made him more dangerous. "Miss McCall," he drawled, "Judge Morrison will be pleased to see you again." "I'm sure he will," Violet said, her voice dripping with false charm. "Right up until the moment those survey maps land in the hands of real federal authorities." Her bluff was razor-sharp, and Tobias prayed it wasn't entirely smoke. "Tell me, Crawford," she pressed, "does Morrison know Tobias has figured out what Martha's father recorded in those maps?" Something flickered across Crawford's face. "What maps?" The words snapped out too quickly, edged with genuine confusion. Tobias's gut tightened. Crawford didn't know. Morrison hadn't told his hired guns about the safe. He'd sent them to kill Tobias and capture Violet, but the true prize was still hidden above their heads. "The survey maps," Tobias said evenly, playing into Violet's hand. "The ones that prove Morrison's been falsifying geological reports for 5 years. The ones showing he sold mineral rights on federal land he had no claim to." Crawford's face drained pale. "A crime like that wouldn't just destroy Morrison. It would drag down every territorial official tied to his conspiracy. Men like Crawford, who'd been pocketing Morrison's bribes, would face federal prison or worse. "Those maps don't exist," Crawford said, but his voice carried no conviction. "Then why are you here?" Violet pressed the pitchfork harder against his neck. "Why did Morrison send 6 armed men to kill 1 rancher and capture 1 prostitute? What's so valuable about this land that it's worth murder?" That was when they heard it, horses thundering toward the ranch at full gallop. Through the barn window, Tobias saw torches flaring against the night, at least 4 riders closing fast. "Back up," he asked. Crawford's smile was cold. "Insurance. Morrison doesn't like loose ends, and he really doesn't like loose ends that might know about non-existent survey maps." Violet met Tobias's eyes across the barn. The same terrible understanding passed between them. Morrison hadn't sent help. He'd sent executioners, men tasked with killing everyone connected to his operation, including his own hired guns. "Those riders aren't here to save you," Tobias told Crawford. "They're here to clean up Morrison's mess." For the first time, Crawford looked afraid, and his fear became their salvation. Faced with certain death from Morrison's cleanup crew, he chose the only option left, allying with his former targets. "There's a back trail through the canyon," he blurted. "My horse is tied behind the house. If we move now, we can be gone before they arrive." "After we get those maps," Violet said sharply, the pitchfork never wavering. Tobias climbed to the loft with Crawford's rifle. Beneath old blankets and rusted tools, he found the safe exactly where he remembered. His hands trembled as he spun the combination Martha had made him memorize years ago. For a moment, he feared it was rusted shut. Then, click. Inside were rolls of survey maps in Martha's father's careful hand. Mineral deposits, water rights, boundaries contradicting every official territorial record. Proof that railroad companies had paid Morrison for fraudulent claims, land he had no right to sell. "Got them," Tobias called, stuffing the maps into his shirt. The riders were nearly on them. Through the window, he saw torches and dark silhouettes, faces hidden, weapons ready. Not lawmen, executioners. "Move," Violet ordered. They ran. Crawford's horse, a sturdy bay, waited behind the house. He mounted first, pulling Violet up behind him. Tobias swung into the saddle of his own gelding from the corral. Together they charged toward the canyon trail. Behind them, flames rose as Morrison's men torched the ranch. Tobias's home, the house where Martha had died, the barn where he had dreamed of raising cattle, went up in fire and smoke. Everything he'd built was burning, but Crawford knew the land. The canyon trail was narrow and treacherous, impossible to follow at night without guidance. By dawn, they were 30 miles away, climbing toward the territorial capital. 3 days later, they sat in the office of Federal Marshal William Hayes, watching him pore over the survey maps with growing fury. One of the few officials Morrison hadn't been able to bribe, Hayes recognized the evidence for what it was: the largest corruption case in territorial history. "Judge Morrison will face federal charges for conspiracy, fraud, and murder," Hayes declared. "With Crawford's testimony and these documents, he'll never walk free again." Crawford, granted immunity in exchange for cooperation, nodded grimly. "Morrison's network stretches across 7 territories, at least 20 federal appointees. This is going to topple half the government." Tobias hardly listened. His eyes were on Violet, who stood at the marshal's window, gazing out at the bustling capital. She had been quiet since leaving the ranch, carrying the weight of years spent running. "What happens now?" he asked softly, once they were alone outside the building. She turned to him, her green eyes calmer than he'd ever seen, peaceful. "Now I testify. I help make sure Morrison never hurts anyone else." And then she stepped closer. Close enough that he smelled simple soap instead of expensive perfume. "If you'll have me, I'd like to help you rebuild that ranch." "I don't have a ranch anymore," Tobias said. "Morrison's men burned it to the ground. You still have the land, and the government will compensate you for the losses and for what Morrison put you through." Her smile was soft, genuine. "Besides, I've got money saved, enough to buy cattle, lumber, whatever we need." 6 months later, Tobias Crow stood on the porch of his new house, watching his wife tend the vegetable garden behind the rebuilt barn. Violet McCall had traded crimson silk for work clothes, painted lips for the natural flush of sun and wind. She had kept her word, not only rebuilding the ranch but rebuilding him. The lonely widower who had once ordered a mail-order bride was gone. In his place stood a man who had discovered that love could take root in the most unexpected soil. Judge Morrison died in federal prison 18 months into his sentence, murdered, by inmates who learned of his crimes against women and children. Crawford became a legitimate lawman in California, and the survey maps that nearly cost Tobias and Violet their lives became the foundation for new federal legislation protecting territorial lands. Sometimes, Tobias would find Violet reading newspaper accounts of Morrison's trial, ensuring justice had been done. But most evenings she spoke only of the future, of improvements to the ranch, of the children they hoped to raise. The rancher had ordered a bride and found instead the love of his life. Some mistakes, Tobias realized, were blessings in disguise. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you stories like this. Your support means everything.